אני אציג את חברי הפאנל הנכבד, ואחר כך נצא לדרך. ראש וראשון יושב ראש הפאנל, פרופסור גד ברזילי, דיקן הפקולטה למשפטים כאן באוניברסיטת חיפה. אנחנו נהפוך אותו ליושב ראש ומשתתף פעיל. אחריו השופטת הנשיאה דליה דורנר, נשיאת מועצת העיתונות. אנחנו ממשיכים בעורך הדין שלומי אברמזון מפרקליטות המדינה, עורכת הדין אביר בכר, לשעבר אחראית על התחום של צדק בפלילים בארגון עדאלה, היום מנהלת הקליניקה לזכויות אסירים כאן באוניברסיטת חיפה, גם עורכת דין פרטית. ואחרונה, לא זכרתי לגמרי איך מבטאים את השם הראשון, אבל אני אדבק בשני, יעל גבירצמן ממרכז מחקר קונקורד לחקר קליטת המשפט הבינלאומי, מנהלת הקליניקה למשפט בינלאומי וזכויות אדם, בית הספר למשפטים, המכללה למנהל. ידידי מנוער, הפרופסור אמנון רייכמן, ביקש ממני הרגע לעסוק בקונקרטי ולא בתיאורטי. אז אולי נתחיל דווקא בקונקרטי. אבא שלי נראה קצת כמו אמנון אברמוביץ' מהטלוויזיה. הוא נשרף בתוך הטנק שלו במלחמת יום כיפור. בן הזוג שלי הוא קצין בשריון, ויחד איתו אכלתי מילואים במשך 15 שנים. אבל שום דבר לא הכין אותי, חברים יקרים, למה שקורה כאשר מדובר בבן. שבועיים ויום היה הבן הבכור שלי לוחם בשריון בתחילת קורס קצינים, סיים את הקורס לפני שבוע בתוך רצועת עזה. ולא, אני לא רוצה לספר לכם על השעות שבהן מרקתי את הבית, או על הסרטים, מה יקרה אם יפנו אותו לסורוקה, ומה יקרה אם יפנו אותו לשיבה, ומה יקרה אם ידפקו בדלת ולמין הודיעה, וגם לא על חוסר היכולת לישון. באתי לספר על מה שהתרחש יום אחרי פיצוץ הנגמש, בתחילת המבצע, שבו נהרגו 6 חיילי גולני ואחד נעדר. קראתי אז את גילי כהן בהארץ. גילי כהן כתבה כך: בצבא אמרו אתמול שההחלטה להכניס את מחלקת הסיור של גדוד 13 בנגמש מיושן התקבלה תוך ידיעה שהמיגון על הכלי אינו מלא. בתגובה לביקורת שהופנתה על השימוש דווקא באמצעי הזה, אמר מפקד פיקוד דרום כי הכוחות מופעלים בצורה מושכלת. זה מה שכתבה גילי כהן. והתגובה הראשונה שלי הייתה, אני מוכרחה לכתוב משהו על שקיפות בתקציב הביטחון, על החור השחור הזה שמאפשר בלי שום ביקורת ציבורית לשלם פנסיות לוועד העובדים שקוראים לו צה"ל, ולא לא משאיר מספיק מיגון לחיילים בחזית. ואז באה התגובה השנייה שלי ואמרה, רגע, אבל הבן שלי בתוך מרכבה סימן 2, אלה שאין להם את המערכות. אם אני אכתוב משהו אני מביאה עליו עין הרע. טפו טפו, כן? אז לא כתבתי כלום. ודבקתי במילה הזאת שאמר אלוף פיקוד דרום, המילה המושכלת. ראש הממשלה יצא למבצע באופן מושכל, לא מעניין אותי לדעת איך השתנו המטרות באמצע. והרמטכ"ל לגמרי נראה שולט במצב, והכל מושכל, וגם האיסור לאפשר הפגנות בכיכר מאוד מושכל, ואין לי מה להגיד עליו, וגם לא לכתוב. ואפשר להבין לגמרי את האלימות, כי אחרי הכל אנחנו במלחמה, ומה שחשוב לי זה שהחייל שלי יחזור בשלום, בלי יותר מדי
שמאלנים. What is important for me during this war is my soldier coming back home. So I start skipping the posts in Facebook where people were criticizing and talking about the damages. I wanted even to unfriend my friends that were sending me posts about damages to the other. I didn't hear from my soldier for 8 days. I was listening to the news and the journalists that talked about the chaos that I experienced. They knew everything that I didn't know. All those journalists that talked about everything that is going on in the south. I was listening to them, trying to understand and figure out the chaos. I had nothing to say about the censorship as well. They tried to change New York Times article. It was well considered. What would have happened if it was been my soldier there? So the victorious image of this war was one mother that failed to deal with cognitive dissonance between the gut and the head, and very simplistically turned off her head and waited for Johnny to go back from the field of battle. So my repentance for those 2 weeks of paralyzation, I'm writing about the freedom of speech and transparency and the state transparency. And I would like to start this panel with you, Gadi, because war is a very extreme condition where so many parameters have been examined, social, cultural, and others. If you can say a few words in order to kick off the session, and then we'll talk about the freedom of speech, whether the criminal circle will be broken, or shall we expand that to the labor law, of course, and the practice of journalists. So good afternoon. There's so many different conferences, especially during the last 2 weeks, about the war. And I asked myself today, what does it actually mean? The War of 40 was so abundant with failures and various problems, what is called failures. And of course, the 57th war and the conquered territories during 67 without the permission of the government in advance, and of course the 73 war. We can also mention the first Lebanese war. And I think this is actually maybe a bit of a contradiction of what I'm trying to state here, that one of the reasons why there are so many conferences about the protective edge operation, especially Minerva conference, is one of the leading ones here. The fact that we do have a certain element of freedom of speech here and of release of the Israeli democracy, or democracy in Israel, concerning the ability of speaking up about wars and arguing about them and disputing the matters connected to war. And I would like to open with a bit of maybe a positive point, and afterwards I'll talk about the problems. First of all, I think it's very good that we're arguing, that we're disputing. That shows that there is a certain element that we cannot really silence up. We do hesitate, we do dispute. We are participating in conferences. Another initial remark I want to note here, that usually we do talk about national security in comparison to freedom of speech, and efforts or trials to balance those two interests, a balancing equations that we're trying to create. But I actually think that one needs to see that from a different perspective, in the following manner. While the freedom of speech is a prevailing value as a part of the human security, what Americans usually call human security. There is no possibility of an existence of safe democracy if there is no freedom of speech, and if you do not preserve the freedom of speech at any cost, especially during extreme conditions and circumstances. And I think we have here with us the Judge Dalia Dorner, and it really stood out in all of her verdicts, the emphasis of the freedom of speech as the prevailing value, as a supreme value that is not up to compromise. Of course, there are limits to all of the values. We're not looking to incite violence that might bring to political assassination, for example, but the freedom of speech is an important value, and it's a core value of democratic regime. I'm not sure, and I really don't think that during the protective edge operation, we were aware of that as a public and as a democratic state, that we did preserve the freedom of speech at any price. I would like to point out a few spaces where the expression was quite problematic during the war. First of all, it starts with what has been mentioned already, the civil activity, the fact that there were cases where was actual violence against those who opposed the war. Not only all that opposed the war, but actually wanted to present a bit of a different perspective, less of a consensual perspective. There were victims of violence, and those are very problematic aspects of a narrowing of the freedom of speech during the war. Secondly, regardless of the fact that the Supreme Court's verdict were quite different, the censorship was very much limited. The military censorship was quite limited in advance. I think during the war there was a very high level of censorship of information and of provision of facts. What definitely influenced the possibility of developing a true public discourse, not just consensual, but dissensual as well, and opposing discourse during the war. And thirdly, of course, we have different open legal cases that are still open against those who expressed different opinions, which led to various conflicts between the employer and employee as a part of the labor relations. And I think we need to examine very particular contexts of different workplaces, but we need to pay attention. What would be the ability of the employer to express his opinions that might not be acceptable by majority and still not to lose his place of work? I will reach the academic world, and before I'll mention that, I would like to say a few words about the media and understand this is not the goal of a panel, but the discourse in the media was very problematic, not because of the legal censorship, but because of the particular social taboo, which is sometimes much more problematic than legal censorship, because if there is a case of censorship, they are courts, they are police, but the social censorship, a taboo in the society, is much more problematic and complex. The TV studios almost did not allow any alternative discourse to be expressed. I really liked the feminist discourse in the TV studios. I liked civil discourse, Arabic Palestinian discourse that have a different perspective of war and the context. Television channels hushed and shushed those voices, and I see here a complex problem that we need to solve. Before I'll go to the academic world, of course, the discourse, we need to pay attention to the relations between Arabs and Jews. I think the space that has been provided or that was allocated to the Arabs of Israel that they could have actually used was very, very limited, and I think that caused violations of freedom of speech during the war. Academic world, as you well know, in the Faculty of Law in our university, 25% of our students, and we're very proud of that fact and very happy about that, they're Israeli Arabs. We do not have an affirmative action, by the way. They comply with all the criteria, just any other students. In the university, it's actually a third of the population are Israeli Arabic students. As a dean, I had a very easy job because there was a complete consensus between Jews and Arabs in our faculty that we should postpone all the exams, maybe even cancel them. So during the war, regardless of my concerns, I didn't face complaints on the limitation of the freedom of speech on the university campus. Yeah, there were challenges in the university, challenges for the Palestinian Arabic minority. But that's not our topic. So as a dean, I'm actually trying to bridge between students. I mediate. I'm not using sanctions. I don't want to use any legal tools. I think the best tool we have is the mediation conversation, disputes, in order to understand the pain of Jews and Arabs. And by the way, mostly people do shake their hands and drink coffee together. I think it's much better than explaining or threatening or using different administrative sanctions. There was another case in Bar Ilan University, which I consulted on to those who needed that. And in Bar Ilan, it's very dangerous. The danger of censorship is definitely present. No, I think that the score was the best method of dealing with the situation. To my opinion, during the war, there were very worrisome events that caused a severe damage to the freedom of speech. Nevertheless, I would like to emphasize that I wouldn't hurry up and try to judge it to such a negative outcome. I think there were very beautiful things in the democratic regime in Israel. By the way, the Brits didn't comply with the majority of some of the tests that we did comply with during the war activity, during the Malvinas War, that are very, very distant from London in comparison to Tel Aviv and Gaza. There were sanctions that are very strict against the freedom of speech at the level of actually reporting of what is going on at the front. We know what happened during the McCarthy period in the United States and during the Cold War. But that, regardless of the fact that it happened, doesn't mean that we do not need to critique or to examine critically the limitations and the obstacles that do exist in Israel during the Protective Edge operation. I thought that we might start with the incitement to violence, but I think that maybe we should really stick to the expression that Abir brought up when she said copy-paste. Copy-paste. There's nothing new about this operation in comparison to the behavior of different enforcement authorities during the previous operation. So therefore, I think I'll have a double question for you. Abir, tell us a little bit about the report that you wrote following the previous operation about the behavior of the authorities or response of the authorities, of enforcement authorities to the civil process during the operation. And afterwards I would ask the Judge Dorner to talk about the report that she wrote in the end of the Second Lebanese War. Let's ask ourselves whether we're actually enjoying to tread water in this particular case, or there is something new in this aspect, or there is nothing new under the sun and we're still telling ourselves the same story. So Abir, let's start with you. Thank you, Tehila. Well, to tell you the truth, before I'll start to talk about the report that has been written, in order not to bore you with details, I must say that in the end of our conversation, our preliminary conversation, when I thought that the situation is not just copy-paste, but it's actually an upgrade of methods that are trying to limit the freedom of speech during the extreme conditions. And the new updates, I must say, especially talk about the law enforcement authorities, because this is my professional field. And I will present you with my everyday experience and my everyday work, my humble experience in the field in a way. But before we'll start, I would like to tell you about my personal experience, and Taylor talked about her personal experience, so let's start with personal. I can tell you that today, after years and years when I was a political activist and I went to demonstrations, yes, demonstration is something that is an expression of community that is expressing its position. Of course, we never planned that become violent. We're intended to bring content and to deliver and convey a message. But today, after I presented those who were arrested and I saw how those arrests are made, I'm not participating in demonstrations. I have children. I don't want to take the risk that I as well will be part of those that will be arrested. And I can tell you that the chances of a person who is throwing a stone during a demonstration or throwing a Molotov bottle, cocktail, is quite identical. We both might find ourselves imprisoned. When, of course, I would like to mention that we never planned the demonstration to become violent. And those who are here, the public, those who experience those demonstrations, I think you all know what I'm referring to, especially during extreme conditions, especially during the protective edge operation. I think they would agree with those matters, because the cooling effect of using this excessive force of an arrest is tremendous. Even if you're arrested without actually, the very fact of your presence on the scene becomes a reason to your arrest. People that do not have a criminal profile, I know exactly what are my laws, what are my obligations, my liabilities, but I can find myself for 24 hours behind the bars. While the courts are also partners in crime to those wholesale arrest practices, and I will show you the practice. We talked about this cooling effect, and of course I would like to emphasize that I do see demonstration that majority of participants are Arabic descent, Arabics, because during those periods, those who protest and those who organize, they usually majority Palestinian Arabs in Israel. In Haifa there is a mixed community, so you'll find a mixed demonstration as well. Where there is a mixed community, it also has been expressed, but majority of the participants are Arabs, are Israeli Arabs, Arabic citizens, and it's not surprising, of course. The reasons are well understood why they are the first to protest against war against Palestinians. But you have to know that from the very beginning there is a cooling effect. Even at the stage of the organizational procedures, while someone decides to organize a demonstration from the very beginning, we choose places and locations where there is no frequency tendencies. We do not want to, we want to express our opinion, to demonstrate our protest, but as legal experts we know that if I'm protesting at the location where people are not exposed to my opinion that I'm trying to express, this is not very effective demonstration and protest, because all the importance of protest is actually presenting the statement to those who are object this statement in order to expose them to different perspectives. From the very beginning, organizing those demonstrations and protests, while we required different permits to demonstrate, of course, we did not receive that, or protests were in them sites that were not confrontational sites. But in those sites as well, in those sites, the very nature of the response of the police and the authorities, especially during turbulent times, the treatment of the protest was as an additional battlefield, and you can read it on the police side as well. The police, by the way, is obliged to protect those who protest, the protesters, against those who protest their statement. Why the police is actually usually there? The ratio is to allow the freedom of speech, to exercise the freedom of speech, and to protect the protesters from those who are trying to silence them up, and to prevent from exercising the right of freedom of speech. But the feeling is that the police is arriving with a certain understanding and feeling, and political guidelines of dealing with another front. Therefore, the response to all the activities that might be inappropriate, arguing, yelling, or maybe someone who had a certain friction with the police threw the stone, and of course there is a criminal law against that, and I definitely support, yes, plus trust me, I don't have to justify my position. I know exactly what is a criminal offense and what is not, and the criminal offense should be treated quietly according to the law. But the result that we're reaching, the outcome that we actually reach, I can find myself arrested. Any friction with the police, the response of the police was absolutely unproportional, in a way that the decision was to declare the demonstration of the protest as illegal and to perform mass arrests. We actually saw those reports, the arrests they published about those demonstrations, the mass demonstrations. We saw that in October 2000 during the protective edge, it repeated itself. And of course there were arrests. We talk about 1,500 of arrests performed by the police, and 650 of legal cases. And 650 of them, there was a criminal case that has been filed, and of course there is a police violence. It's all reported in the media. But some things are not reported, and this is where the danger is. I'm not even talking about the unproportional attitude towards those who allegedly performed a criminal offense. I would like to talk about those people that are about to exercise their right of freedom of speech, but found themselves in the end of the day behind the bars in prison or different detention facilities while the arrest has been prolonged methodically. And the court, by the way, I'm not arriving there as a detainee. There was a mass court hearings, and it's, as a defense attorney, I can express my feeling of something that is completely out of control. Several will try to do now all those things that I learned. But the importance of freedom of speech, and the real test of the freedom of speech is actually my protest of war. Well, this is not something that is controversial. I'm just opposing a war and violence. And then I find myself in prison. This is, even if it's actually provokes the consensus. Your son was in the army, and many of you, your children were in the army. Actually, those who live here, I live here and I understand your concerns, I understand your worry. But if I talk about the enforcement authority, this is the real test of the human rights. When your son, as you as a judge, your son is in the front, how can you deal with those who protest? The patriotic, heroic act that he's performing, you maybe actually support that as well. I don't think it's a patriotic act, really. And protesters thought they were they were crimes against humanity. And we need to stop the circle of violence, the circle of war. What was not reported in the media? What was not reported in the media were cases where police knew that there is no reason for arrest, but they used their authority in order to expel people and to detain people for more than 2 weeks while the court wasn't willing to set a hearing date. And that creates certain situation. Well, as a mother of young children and a employee of the university, why should I put myself in such a vulnerable position? I'll be distant from home for 2 weeks. Yes, it might actually influence people while considering to express their freedom of speech. And this is how things are today. I would like to address now Judge Dorner. When Elaine Sadai decided in August to reverse complaints against Gideon Levy, the journalist from Aris paper. He is the legal counsel of the Journalist Council. You always said that the freedom of speech is a beating heart of the democracy, and that freedom of speech is supposed to protect controversial opinion. So my first question is whether since the report that has been written after the Second Lebanese War, there is an escalation. And the other question is maybe a little bit different question. Whether you think that the state is the only one that is limiting the freedom of expression, whether the newspapers are limiting themselves. Is it possible? Because there's no some kind of guiding hand from above when the journalist says, first of all, I'm an Israeli, and afterwards I'm a journalist. That presents a certain very clear statement. When I took the elevators, actually, so you can, this person who spoke on behalf of the university, when we arrived to another floor, he guided us and we talked on our way, and she asked me what am I going to talk about and what is my position concerning the statement that Wallace editor said, first of all, I'm the Israeli and afterwards I'm the journalist. He said, well, there's someone says, first of all, I'm Israeli and then I'm a physician. Well, he has the job. He's a journalist. He needs to bring information to the public. Of course, there is censorship. There's certain things that are forbidden from exposure, and as a part within the frame of to fulfill his position. It was hard for him to accept that. And now let's go back to the report that I brought, and it has been filed to the Council of Journalists on 18th of April 2007 after the war in Lebanon. I was elected as the chairman of the council. There was quite a negative attitude towards the media. Media lost the war. As you remember, from the Second Lebanese War, people of Israel were not very satisfied with the outcome. There were a lot of claims, a lot of complaints. Remember, there were 12 reservists that were killed, and the newspaper was found guilty. Well, we received complaints, awful things, really. We said, let's found a committee. There were so many different committees. The Vinograd committee said, okay, this is the only committee that is headed by the Supreme Court for a judge. And together with me, and I would like to mention the names of members of the committee because the most important one was Zeev Shiv, who was a military journalist, with a legendary one, with amazing experience. There was also Avi Bnei, who was then the commander of Galei Tzahal, Israeli military radio station, and afterwards the IDF speaker. And Yaron Inosh, me, and Professor Yaakov Perry. So we wrote the ethical rules, and I'm talking about the ethical rules during the war. This is exactly our subject. We wrote the opening statement. I wrote the opening statement, but my colleagues signed, of course. They was very active. And days after he signed the report, unfortunately, he passed away. And we really started to get to know each other. This man had amazing practical experience in this field, and I would like to read what we actually wrote, and that expresses my perception of professional ethics of the Council of Journalists. It has been issued and approved by the members of the committee. The approach of keep quiet, keep silence, because we're shooting now, and the recruited media that is closing its eyes because of patriotic ideas and preventing any criticism is again unacceptable. The recruited and this biased media presents the public with the biased reality that is damaging our democratic regime. We're leaving the stage to the world press that provides an information that our press is not presenting. This is also from an estrangement point of view. The media is required during the emergency to preserve the basic foundations and principles of a freedom of speech and journalism, subjected to the limitations that are necessary in order to preserve the safety of our state and human lives. I think there is certain criticism. Well, we do have the censorship, of course, but I think under those circumstances it's a good thing. And the journalist has to be very quiet with, that the censorship approved and that the censorship is guiding him under the guidance of the Supreme Court, so the newspaper for their own profit. That has absolutely nothing to do with democracy or safety, security, will damage our state. To present criticism in responsible manner, the way it's required by the ethical standards. And I'm quoting Pavel Margelian, who is the man who's Pravia Radio in a Russian language. He's an editor, the chief editor there, and this gentleman said the following: our listeners, Jews that arrived from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, our listeners were very patriotic. We were patriotic, but the media that is not criticizing the army and the government is not media, it's something else. It's a military station that needs to yell, okay, go, we'll show them. Some of our listeners see patriotic approach as lack of criticism. The expression of patriotism for them is not to criticize, but they live by the rules of media in the Soviet Union. It's still within them. I think that the media, under any circumstances, is supposed to tell what is going on in reality. And of course, I'm aware of that. That is happening all over the world. When there is war, there is an emergency state. The media is not objective. It can't report about what the state of Israel is in the way that the Gaza journalists will report. And even the British reporter who is, his child is not participating in this war. His relatives are not being bombed every day. He's a neutral in a way. He can reform. But the world is open and the facts has to be reported. The facts have to be reported, as the speaker said before. I understand that we need to present the facts. But why do I have to bring the facts about what's going on with our enemy? This is not my matter. I'm, as a citizen of the State of Israel, want to know what's going on from both sides. I want the empathy. It can't be differently. There is war. Soldiers are in danger. They're fighting. They are our soldiers. I want to know what's going on there. I first of all want to be aware of the facts. Otherwise, it's not a medium. You remember how the Russian journalists said, they can say, okay, march and conquer them. March and conquer is not journalism. It's not medium. Nevertheless, we need to be aware of the reality. We need to know that there is a certain reality all over the world. When there is war, somehow the media becomes more patriotic. This is an internal censorship, but what are the limits? After the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Journalist Councils assembled, and the members, including the journalists, admitted and repented that they were blind to the criticism, that if they would actually publish what they had to publish, the reality might have changed, and it has been expressed. In the democratic state, the role of the media, subjected to censorship law, is to bring and present the public with the facts. In our recommendation, we recommended to present the facts to the fullest. If, for example, there is a missile that is launched against Haifa and something happened or it didn't, you can't really create panic. You need to bring aboard a picture, the 3,000 cars driving, and there is a car accident. You usually tell about the car accident. You do not. There was actually a complaint from the Arabic citizens that presented it to our council that during the Second Lebanese War, half of those who suffered injuries or were killed during this war were Arabic citizens. And it hasn't been expressed in the media. Only in one case, when the father said that There were 2 sons that were killed, and he said they were shaheeds. And that was reported. He said that we saw that those who died from both communities will actually bring us closer, but you do not express that. We said you have to express that. Think about the war, give the full picture. You have to express the understanding that here in the State of Israel as journalists, we're not from United Nations, we're Israeli journalists, but it doesn't mean that we need to conceal facts. That doesn't mean we need to conceal facts, but we need to present those facts. We need to know what's going on, of course, in our country with all the empathy. If our child is killed, but we need to know what's going on at the other side as well of the border. Yes, we are allowed to critique. We're allowed to bring critique. And during the first panel, you mentioned proportionality, what is allowed, what is not allowed. What is proportional response? A proportional response has a value basis, value foundation. It's not just balance. There's certain core values that a democratic state cannot disregard. As a citizens of Israel, I want to know what are those values are. Not from BBC, not CNN reports. I want to learn it from my journalists, and I think it's the ethical role to bring it to me, to present me with that. And I understand that they have to do that using the empathy, which is a human and absolutely understanding. It can't be prevented. A journalist is a human being. He is also a citizen of the State of Israel. This is legit. Well, there were 2 circles that were presented here. First of all, the limitation of freedom of speech by the authority of the state. But from the other hand, we do talk about censorship that I think is even more threatening, which is the internal or self-censorship of the media. And I think about the situation in which we need to switch from 5 hours of news to 20 hours of news. How will that actually implement? And I think this is one of the reasons that the media is becoming more and more savage behavior of the media. But one of the recommendations we said that the open wave was a catastrophe, really. People talked to rubbish, really. It was complete nonsense because they had to fill up hours and hours. Things were not fact-checked, and each former general became an expert, even if it doesn't matter who he was. And of course, they gave advices. But that really bothered the army as well, by the way. You have to understand, hours and hours of nonsense. It was a lose-lose situation. We all lost, I think. Well, maybe just the television owners that had otherwise a reason to ask a regulator for relief on the regulation. So if you actually bring in someone at 10 o'clock in the morning to the studio, and then you bring someone else because you know that it's going to be a mud war, you know that you want to keep your viewers glued to the screen. So the whole system of consideration is very interesting one. But I want to go back to you, Shlomi, to examine the facts, the role of the state as the one who limits the borders of freedom of speech, especially from the criminal perspective. I think what's actually happened during the protective age in the media concerning the racism was this kind of a psychoanalysis of the racism in our society. Why are we racist? Is it because the Ministry of Education is not raising us properly? But the question is, what's happening at this particular point of time where the sewage is overflowing the social networks and is spilling into the real world? Did you see, or maybe you can give us even examples if you did, where, as psychiatrists usually say, where there was not a psychoanalysis but a cognitive treatment, a behavioristic cognitive treatment, fast, focused and painful, but designated to treat this particular problem, this uncontrolled violent racism. Afterwards, we'll ask Yael to present us an international perspective. Well, I was not about I didn't want to talk about demonstrations and protests, but it's really hard for me to deal with those sensations and with those general statements. I know how to deal with facts. That's my job. I am focusing on particular aspects, and of course, I can tell you that from my understanding, from those who part of the Israeli police, that yes, I think that there is no any guiding hand of the police of Israel that is trying to prevent the protesters from presenting their perspective with their opinion is inconvenient for the state. No, there is no such state of affairs. And the methodic arrest, we have a very impressive law system. There are courts, and if they decided that someone has to stay, probably there were evidence afterwards. There is possibility of appeal. You can contact court and you can request a protest permit. This whole emotional, and I respect those emotions, and maybe even understand this emotion. They are solutions that are they institute solutions. I would like to refer to what we experienced during the war, and I would like to quote from different social networks. The third Intifada, violence against Jews. We're looking for settlers to stab them. Well done, Hamas. We love you, Hamas. You will screw them in Gaza, and will screw your daughters, you stinking Jews, and etc., etc. And those who would like to, if you want revenge, yes, we'll do that. And after the murder of Mohammed Abu Khdeir, they will continue the struggle, and the murder of 3 children, 3-1 in our favor, and the Eliyahu gang. A dead Arab is a good Arab. The idea to find as many people as possible and to beat them up and to crush their skulls. Those are just a few random examples from the online social media networks. This is a bit of an extreme situation. There were different attacks on Jewish citizens that went into eastern Jerusalem and in Arabic villages in the north. There was a disgusting murder of Mohammed Abu Khdeir. There were attacks on Arabic citizens, not necessarily in the areas of the mixed cities. We are here today when we talk about Rabin assassination, and I think it's a very interesting perspective of trying to analyze where this propaganda led to the particular activity. Nobody can prove that Yigal Amir acted as a result of a propaganda of, and whether do you think that it influences opinions or not? Do you think it will provide legitimate approach and supports? Well, I think that yes, of course, it does influence. And let's talk a little bit about how we actually can analyze various cases that are dealing with incitement to violence. Well, the freedom of speech is the core of democracy. That's what allows complexity of our society, critique, voices of minority, and those who are responsible for criminal enforcement in this field. This is our opening point while we are analyzing various cases. First of all, the freedom of expression is not absolute value. There are limitations that are set by the legislator. Incitement of violence, support of terroristic organizations, racism, additional point that we're analyzing and we took into account in order to preserve the critique. Each party, the left and the right, are absolutely sure that things that they say, and we experience it in the media and in the parliament, the things that they say, they are included into the freedom of speech law, but the other party is just violating the freedom of speech, and they're trying to initiate new war. If the left, for example, wrote about Amnon Levy that the bad are going to Gideon Levy, the bad ones are going to the air forces as a critique, the right sees it as slandering of Israeli air forces. We're not getting into analysis of what is critique. We're using the tools that the legislator provided us with. We have to be very well measured, we have to be very well considered, and we have to be very moderate. And we're also facing all the time the phrase, I would object to what you say, but I will give my life in order to protect your right to say the things you say. And this is, of course, for example, the Gideon Levy case, and the statement by Hanin Zoabi following settlements, boys' murder. I think it's an appropriate statement, but it's still included into the limitations of the law of freedom of speech. And of course, the immunity of parliament members is also a point here. We're very, very thorough while using our consideration. In enforcement, it's very easy to use the criminal enforcement, but we need to be very well measured, very well considered. When do we do that? I would like to refer to other examples, that new world of violence and racism. I would like to talk about the cooling effect that is so often been mentioned. Well, I do accept that, for example, the golden path is the educational scene. But when there is a certain phenomenon that exists already, and it accelerates and it becomes part of our reality, I think the criminal law has to be involved. So the cooling effect talks about if we will forbid certain expressions or will criminalize certain expressions, people will not express themselves in that manner. And I would like to put as a question mark here, because I think that actually a clear definition of the borders of the discourse allows a true freedom of speech and a discourse. Racial discourse actually limits the freedom of speech. And from time to time, I think the criminal treatment of those particular expressions will allow this very critical discourse that is necessary for a democratic existence. It can be offensive, but it will not create a sense of instability in those who do not support those particular opinions. And I would like to talk about the new violence and racism. We were used to different posters and conferences and graffiti. The main communication channel that is old and new, of course, and it became the main tool during the operation is the Facebook and YouTube and etc. This is a very important scene, this is a very important world that just fertilized the freedom of speech. It used to be a privilege of the academics and the decision makers. Today we can influence the public discourse with the push of a button, and this is a new city square that influenced tremendously for the good. It's expanding the circles. I'm sending it to my favorite prince. The other one is bringing it forward to the other one. But it can be also devastating. It can be also devastating, and it's full of various racial statements. And I'm not even talking about the conversation with my friends. So my capability of actually registering matters.
משחררת את הדמויות, והיא, אני חושב, מביאה לאותו שיח אלים. גם היכולת הזאת ללחוץ על לייק, לשתף, הופכת גם את מושא הטקסט, מושא הסטטוס, לשותף פעיל, תומך בעצמו. הוא מתחיל גם בסוג של עשייה בפני עצמה. אומנם זה לחיצת כפתור, אבל עשיתי משהו אקטיבי, שממנו אולי אפשר להידרדר לפעולות, כמעין מדרון חלקלק, לפעולות יותר אלימות ויותר גזעניות.
אני קוטעת אותך רק לשנייה, כי אני רוצה לכוון את הדברים, את הזמן שנותר לך את הדברים.
We to talk about.
לאור כל מה שאמרת עכשיו, זה היה נדמה כאילו אתה מנסה להצדיק גם...
It actually seems that you try to justify an overuse of criminal punishment. Well, the reality is actually quite different. On one hand, you describe a very racist and very extreme discourse that is very violent. And yes, we do talk about the right of freedom of speech. But this no didn't arrive. But whether you have a strategy as the legal advisor to the government is not issuing, for example, the Torah Melech, the racist book written by one of the rabbis, or post on Facebook. So what are you waiting for? Something will happen and then you will start working really hard, like just similar to what happened after the assassination of Rabin? There is a strategy here. Well, first of all, the legal advisor as well, they talked about enforcement of in this field, and it's not just rhetorics. Well, when we talk about the cyber unit of the police and another very cool, they allocated to this mission a lot of budget. There is also the unit that is accepting complaints of the citizens of against violence and racism. There were limited amount of claims filed. They not always justify a criminal involvement, but yeah, we have a certain statement that is maybe a bit new, especially considering the public atmosphere during the war when the blood is boiling, and therefore there is a possibility that violent or racist expression might lead to an act. You have to remember that when we talk about the incitement of violence offense, this is not just the statement itself. I need to prove the probability that there is a real, which is not, of course, probable opportunity that the violence might occur as a result of this particular statement. I need to prove that. I need to comply with certain level of connection between the statement and the act of violence, that it might lead to terror or acts of violence. How can we examine that? How can we test that? Of course, a lot of questions from the legal perspective, but I don't think that's the right place to discuss that. But I'll try to provide you with a number of considerations that we might consider while we're examining different statements online. Of course, the content of publications, well, there is the clear the statement is when you cannot misinterpret that. Whether it's a Jewish group, or I'm sorry, designated group that has been published in order, it has been founded in order to present a violent statements such as, for example, Al Yehud gang, the group on Facebook. Well, we can say that there is no immunity to Facebook pages and statuses on Facebook and personal Facebook books, where as well, if there is an incitement of violence or racism, we'll talk about, of course, the scope of exposure, what were the responses to this particular, how many likes it received, how many shares it received, how well it has been spread, and the more responses we get, we learned that there was an influence. This is how we try to establish the influence of this particular status of racism or violence. We'll definitely take into account not necessarily expressions after you read few posts before. You sometimes respond in order to protect, in order to argue, and sometimes the response can be racial as well. So we will analyze the content
אופן הפרסום, האם זה היה תגובה,
the way of
זה היה פוסט פרסום שלך. האם מדובר
response,
בטוקבק, או
whether it's a
פוסט
talk back,
בעמוד פייסבוק,
or is it your Facebook page,
אם זה ילד בן
who is
12,
who is actually
שיש לו יותר,
publishing it,
השפעה.
whether it's a child who is 12 years old or someone who is an influence.
בעיקר, אני חושב
And of
שזה
course, I
עשייה.
think,
מה זה כמה זמן זה היה
what do you mean how long it has been online? It's always online.
כמה זמן זה היה?
What does it mean how long has it been online?
הרבה מאוד
Until it has been removed. So many status
לגביהם,
that complaints were filed. When we started to work and we looked for the status, it wasn't there anymore. Maybe it has been removed, or the Facebook itself following the complaints, and they have such an activity on Facebook, they just removed it. Yes, that's something. And the public atmosphere, of course, is a very important matter. The public climate, and we talk about here during the emergency conditions, while the public climate is, you know, we hear that the soldiers are being killed, and there's a lot of hatred that has been poured from Gaza Strip as well. So each party has a very emotional response. So therefore, that becomes much more explosive. And during those particular extreme periods, the need of enforcement, criminal enforcement, is even more acute and very more severe. And of course, people that are publishing on Facebook for the first, and he arrived to the investigation, he explained himself, he provided a certain context. Just would like to state that
בקצרה, אני אגיד לסיום, כי כבוד השופטת בדימוס גאון,
Mrs. Dorner that is here,
לחשוב האם איזה משקל יש, או איזה רצון
we need to think what would be the weight and what is the desire of the media to take part in this fight and this struggle, because there were so many very violent and very racist expressions in leading newspapers such as Ynet and Walla. Another site, I forgot its name, and yeah, there's endless amount of expressions of that sort. They need to develop the internal mechanism of control, just like Facebook knows to remove problematic statements. The media is about to should remove talkbacks that are very violent. There's no need in such a feedback. I heard from Yom Feder while he was an editor on Ynet that 2/3 of the talkbacks are already being removed. So you have to understand that third that you're saying is actually after it has been censored. And I think you also brought up here a very interesting point. Who sets the scope of freedom of expression online? And if commercial company with commercial interests is the one who sets the boundaries of our discourse, or do we need an Israeli censor here involved in this particular process? I would like to talk to you, Yael, in order to hear from a perspective that's a little bit more international perspective. To what extent anti-racism laws are a limitation of the freedom of speech, and whether the balance that Shlomi presented here is a basic balance that we need to take into account. What are the limitations here? Well, it's very tempting, as one of the last speakers during the speech, the temptation is to actually start to talk about different important matters that were brought up by our speakers, but I'll try to comply with this temptation. I will present you with the main matter. My name is Yael Vias, and I am the mediator in the Concord clinics, whose initial target is the implementation of the international law in the internal law, the practical aspect where the international law can provide tools for the practical aspects of our law, the balance between the rights and limitation of rights. I also manage now the international law clinic in the Bein Tchumi College, and I'm mentioning it because when you analyze the freedom of speech and its limitations and the prohibition of incitement against violence, the different sources, of course, comparison law, international law, and international criminal law are being parts. So first of all, about the obligation of the country and liability of the country to deal with this phenomena. From one hand, the state is obliged to protect the freedom of speech and not to limit the freedom of speech, not to promote violence and racism, and the bigger the influence of a person is and he's seen as a representative of the state, the responsibility is obviously heavier. He has to. And of course the enforcement, as Shlomi presented here, when there is a phenomenal propaganda of violence and racism, they are obliged to enforce. So let's talk about this theme, the border between violence and the freedom of speech. So for a few points that were mentioned, but I'm allowed to speak and I'm allowed to express my opinion, the freedom of expressing my opinion, as Judge Dorner said, are the foundation milestones of the democracy. It's the heart of the democracy. Of course, we're allowed to bring critique, and of course, we're allowed to hate. The question, how do you critique? And the comparison, whether there is incentive to implement violence. In order for it to be a criminal, one has to show that there is a connection between the statement that induces violence and the act of violence. And but racism is considered to be as violence, it's within itself. And this is the international criminal law. For example, the inducement of genocide. There is no need in a genocide itself because the crime has been committed already, the violence already there. The racism is violence by the definition. So there is still no violence. When we talk about the incitement, inducement of violence, we do need to prove that the violence occurred directly as a result of this particular statement. I was actually looked at, I have a report that hasn't been published. It's on behalf of Concord during the protective edge operation, and I followed different developments on the daily basis. There were more and more facts that we had to add to this report since it hasn't been published yet. Unfortunately, that's the Israeli-Palestinian reality. I actually examined different treaties of the civil rights and political rights, for example, international human rights law. But clause number 19, for example, from the treaty that is establishing the freedom of speech and the importance of the freedom of speech as the milestone of democracy and the foundation of democracy. It is not allowed to force a human being to adopt a certain opinion. You cannot force a man to think, for example, to sing national anthem against his will. Clause number 19, 300, talks about the possibility of limiting the freedom of speech and the commitment of the state to prohibit inducement of violence, hatred, and racism. So I wanted to bring two examples, very particular examples from various institutions of international law, different institutes of international law, and today we have, of course, supervision. Each treaty has been supervised. And that's the Human Rights Committee by United Nations. And this is not the Council of the Human Rights, which has a certain reputation in the world. Human Rights Committee is the committee that constitutes of professionals, and for the protocol, the individuals can file complaints in front of this committee, and the committee of experts provides communications. They're not judges. And the two very interesting and relevant cases now talk about how to critique and termination of employment, and the one was case against France in the 90s, and one of the writers was David
היה חבר בוועדה הרבה שנים.
was a person who was a member of this committee for many years.
בעצם הוועדה לקחה תיק קונקרטי.
It was a very particular case of limitation of freedom of speech, while the only against France and other rose against Canada. An individual said the state limited my freedom of expression. They said that it was racism, but maybe whether it was proportional or not.
במגבלות המשפט הבינלאומי. אוקיי, אז בתיק הראשון,
During the first case,
בעצם הנקודה המעניינת הייתה
a very interesting point was that
ליישם את העקרונות.
when you try to implement those cases, first of all, we're allowed to limit the freedom of speech, and it has to be done based on law, and law has to be very clear. Why such a limitation that requires criminal act? One has to prove the criminal intent, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the point that was very interesting in those two cases was the point of the circumstantial context. The context is influential in this case. It influences. So the prohibition of inducement of violence, evisceration of incline in Rousseau against France case. That on one hand there was a limitation of the inducement of violence. It has to be interpreted in a very narrow manner, the narrowest manner, and has to comply with the criteria of freedom of speech. From the other hand, to state that something is included in inducement of violence defined by law is not enough, it's not sufficient in light of circumstances and the context. So for example, in Ross against Canada, there was a teacher in school and preschool, and there were no students of a certain other background that were not white, that were not Caucasian, let's say. But he said on Facebook and other he had different expressions of racism because in this school there was a racist environment. So the termination of this teacher was actually justified. And how can you distinguish between a justified termination or not? Termination is a punishment. Is it a double negative punishment? There is also a criminal activity against this particular individual, and there is also, and he's also losing his job, whether it's a double jeopardy or not. Another case, a man has a certain influential position, and his statements bear a weight, a heavier weight, and are connected to the implementation of those statements that have been translated into acts of violence. And the last case, there was a verdict of the Supreme Court in Rwanda during the last month of 2012. It's a very interesting case because there was a limitation of freedom of speech that I think majority of us would accept, that this law criminalized a denial of genocide in Rwanda. We also have such a law. In many countries, actually, we have Australia, Czech Republic, Germany, long list of countries. The case they analyzed, and that is today being analyzed by the African Human Rights Committee, and it's still open case, was the use of the prohibition of denial of Holocaust, of genocide, and use of this particular tool as a political tool in order to imprison journalists. And there were two journalists. One of them was sentenced for 17 years, and another was less than 10 years, since they retold the history of the internal dispute and external dispute in Rwanda. If you're familiar with Rwanda genocide in '96, you know that some of the critical decisions by the International Tribunal were whether that was a genocide, because the others claimed that it was an ethnical combat. So while they said it was an ethnical combat, that is considered to be a denial of genocide, and the Supreme Court cleared them from blame that
לעומת זאת, הן כן צריכות...
From the other hand, they do need to be in prison because other laws limit the freedom of speech in Rwanda, including critique of the existing regime. And here they're actually filing their complaint against the Human Rights Committee. Well, I think if we'll try to sum up what has been said up to now here, we have there is certain polarization, and Abir says the regime is not allowing, the state is not allowing to speak up and to protest, and there is another perspective where we're trying to persuade Shlomi to enforce a little bit harder against problematic racial expressions online. And why do you talk about the importance of the right of freedom of speech, but from the other hand, things are not treated properly? At this very limited time that we have, I would like to expand the scope and to talk about the economical punishment, economical treatment that is being used against expressions that are not seen as a consensus. We have two verdicts of the labor courts in Israel, one of them on the matter of an employer from 365, the retail store that supported Gaza population. I don't think it was actually against Israelis, it was just a support, and she has been fired. And the labor court restored her employment in comparison to the decision of Lud Mayor to fire a psychologist that wrote things after the soldiers were killed during the operation. She has been fired, and the labor court approved this decision. So I will get to the matter. I would like to ask you, during the second round, of course you're welcome to refer to other matters, whether one can create a sliding scale, who is allowed to fire, whether there is a difference between Cellcom as a private company and, for example, different authorities, whether the law authorities, university, for example, is different from municipality, and whether we can actually differentiate between different professions and not just different types of expressions. There's a difference between doctor and psychologist, who is more, or salesperson or cashier or anything. I don't know. This is my first question I would like to bring up. Another question whether you're interested to refer to. The freedom of speech and additional freedom of speech expression was around the request of B'Tselem to read out loud or to screen names of children in Gaza that were killed during this operation. The Broadcast Authority of Israel refused complete, which just shows the organizational chaos they're experiencing. But in the end of the day, the Supreme Court approved the decision of not allowing such a broadcast. And Professor Kremitzer wrote that we have to be capable of seeing above the prohibition of commercials of a political nature. There is absolute political, there is a universal category that is a humanitarian category. I don't necessarily agree with that from the rule of law perception. I'm not really sure that they need broadcast authorities to try to invent reasons to allow to prohibit. But let's start with Gadi anyway. Let's limit it for 3-4 minutes. Unfortunately, I'll have to leave at 1:30, so allow me please to be the first speaker. What can I tell you? I would have tried not to limit this to those particular questions. We're experiencing very difficult public climate from the perspective of racism and violence. When I'm referring to us, I'm talking about the Jewish people, the Jewish state. And I think that we are majority. And we're responsible for that, yes, very true. We're all equal, that's very true, and we're all equal in front of the law. And while it's racism of both parties, for example, Arabs towards Jews, Jews towards Arabs, it should be treated in a similar manner. But we need to take into account the fact that the influence is accumulated if the president of our state visits Court of Qasem and afterwards they write that he should die for that. There is a problem, and so I think that we cannot wait. I don't know what's going on with that, but we have a serious problem, a very severe problem in the state of Israel. We can understand that from a sociological perspective, due to the wars, so many that we lost, our soldiers, on social background, but the explanations are irrelevant. There is a real problem that we're facing, and I would like to, there is a president of Israel that tells about the talkbacks that he received because he visited Kfar Qasem. There is a problem, that's for sure, but what to do? And I do not think that there is a dispute here, that there is a certain situation in which we need to, maybe not necessarily fire, I wouldn't give the authority to fire employers due to political statements. I think it's an awful thing. The labor courts has to protect that. With a psychologist, I don't want to get into it. I don't want to be particular, but it's very clear for me that when we talk about the inducement of violence and racism, you don't have to wait for the results of racism. It's not new. That was the verdict of the Supreme Court. Unanimous. I'm sorry, not unanimous, despite, I think, the opinion of Theodore Orr and Aaron Barak that wanted to introduce the probability into the factor. I was the one that supported that. I don't even know whether in the criminal law what to do with the probability. Well, above any reasonable doubt, probability above any reasonable doubt, there's a problem. Racism is racism. Racist statement is a racist statement. It doesn't matter what I'm saying, kill all the Jews or kill all the Arabs. I don't know whether it will influence or not, but the very fact that criminal law has to be involved here, and during such a hard period where everything is allowed, where everything is accepted, I don't think it will be a limitation of the freedom of speech if the system, our enforcement system will respond. If our governance system will respond on matters of racism, I think it has to be very clear in public, from a public perspective. I hear awful things, and I'm supporting the freedom of speech. When people say something that is disgusting and unspeakable, they say this is the freedom of speech, but this is not the freedom of speech. This is something that law forbids. This is forbidden by law. Well, I would like to, yes, I would actually respond to in a more generic level. First of all, I would like to go back to the war, and war was asymmetrical war, and it's very important to remember that for the discussion. When we talk about the asymmetrical wars, they are questions of sensitivity, of the suffering. Well, of course, there was a destruction, but the destruction in Gaza was very comprehensive and very massive. Hannibal procedure, for example, ignored completely the fact that the cannibal procedure not necessarily justify the destruction scope of Rafah, and I think it will be another problem on the level of different committees. But during the asymmetric war, I think we have a problem of how the legal space, the legal environment allows the voices of suffering of others to be heard. And I want to give two examples. One is the Supreme Court, B'Tselem's Supreme Court plea that was rejected, and I think it was justified, this rejection. And the B'Tselem Supreme Court plea is the proof that the court does not allow the voices that expressing the pain and suffering of others to be heard. And there were absolutely no any discussions about the international law. IDF was the de facto speaker that said, okay, all the activities were approved of the legal department of IDF and everything is okay. There was absolutely no referral to international law, and after the end of the military activity, there was this very, I would say, strange refusal of the government to cooperate with the International Investigative Committee. I personally, I would actually completely disqualify myself. I would have been the chairman of this committee, but this is something else. But from the other hand, to cooperate with the International Committee is definitely the right thing to do. Why not to do that? But to the lack of proof of any critical analysis of decision-making process from the perspective of international law just shows us to what extent the Israeli society, including the legal society of Israel, didn't fail to face a challenge that allowed the voices of the others to be heard, and of course without limiting the voices of our side. First of all, it wasn't clear. It has to be clear. There is an intent to enforce much harder and harsher, and we opened dozens of different investigations, and I think that it's very clear to us that something has to be changed, and that the situation in the future will be very, very different. So it wasn't clear. I would like to clarify that again. I would like to refer to another point that I didn't have time to refer in my previous speech, and it maybe touches a little bit of the racism. In addition to the public climate that I mentioned and what Yael just mentioned, hate crimes, there is another clause of offense that allows to double the law in a situation in which the act has been a result of the racism, motivation, and there was an increase. And this clause has been used recently. When I'm referring to the termination of employment, I can tell you that from a criminal perspective, we will take that into account. Again, it is not dependent, of course, it depends on the scope and this act itself, but will definitely take into account whether the employer has been fired, whether there is still a need and a public interest in a criminal prosecution. I don't think not everyone is familiar with the Lod municipality case. She was a psychologist that is treating children and teenagers from the Arabic sector, and she expressed joy after the death of 16 soldiers, and the court decided that an expression of joy and happiness in light of death of citizens of Israel is actually a disrespect of educational values that she's supposed to represent while working with the teenagers, and the court definitely paid a lot of attention to the role of her position actually in the municipality, since her obligation was to bringing the values of respect and equality and value of human life. So that's the concept. There is a difference between someone who is treating and educating and someone who is selling apples. Of course, definitely, we do put a lot of weight on the status of the speaker, especially when we talk about aspects of education in the context of racial statements. Racist statements, I'm sorry. And to the response to what has been said, she said, well, it is a very emotional period, of course. Well, maybe you said that it's because she's a woman. Are you referring to the gender aspect? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. But there's so different verdicts and decisions. When we wrote about the forbidden protest, I quoted the judges, how they wrote that the protesters should thank us that we allow them to protest, and during the protective edge there were different judges that expressed and mentioned the war that is taking place in our sounds at the front, which is absolutely irrelevant for the verdict that they were writing. There are so many different examples, and what am I referring to? That's what I'm referring to, and I can write another report about that. But this is not emotional response, but I wanted to quote judges and to show you how they present their verdicts. And it's very important for me that this message will be absorbed, that in the state where the freedom of speech is described as a core value of the legislation and the existence, in reality, even regular ordinary citizens will think twice whether he's allowed to speak freely or not. But I don't want to talk about the legal definition of those offenses. I would like to use this possibility. I think there is a minority of Arabs that are here. I think we're naive, and the state is hypocritical. The way they treat racism on the criminal aspect, well, we all know very well that the treatment of racist statements will not be equal and similar, and we do not think we're going to change it. Do you think that the fact that she was fired, this psychologist, will change it? And do you think that those who are saying death to Arabs will be brought to court? Do you think it will change their understanding? If you allow segregation between different populations in court, you do not expect a different result and different outcome. I think there is a direct line between the segregation, complete segregation in which we live here, while there is a segregation in the daily life, in the cultural life, in the residential aspect, and now it has been expressed and legitimized by the Supreme Court. So why are you amazed that during the extreme and tumultuous moments, while you identify with the son who is a soldier, and I identify with my Arabic brothers in Gaza. As a mother, I understand your pain, but I see that your soldier is performing a crime. And by the way, I think that those who would like to take care of racism, you do not start with criminal law. There is absolutely no advantage here. There is no use in it. We're just ruining the discourse because it doesn't even exist. And there's something that is already illegitimate anymore. But in our houses, in the kindergartens, in the schools, when those different curriculum is about to serve different political needs, we're not taking care of that. And I think that the crime wave, and that's the result. And it is the crime. This is the real crime. And know the expressions on Facebook of the psychologist. I didn't even talk about the discrimination, the element of discrimination of the suppression of protests. And I would like to refer you to the findings that usually when there is a demonstration, and I'll just give you one liner here, I do expect that when the settlers on the occupied territories protested the Gaza evacuation plan, the majority of them were absolved from criminal responsibility. I want the state to discover oversensitivity to the acts that are within the borders of criminal law, the forbidden acts that the protesters did, and will be absolved from the criminal prosecution. If the state would like to prove wide scope of vision and understanding of the other, I want it to happen. And I do expect that when I see during the ultra-Orthodox demonstrations violent behavior, and day after I see that they are being released homes, because as an attorney it's important for me to see how I will use that. I want to see the verdict, and I see majority of them are going home. Very few are staying even under house arrest, and in comparison to the Arabs that for weeks can be left in prisons and detained facilities, and there is no any. Yes, I do have an ability, and I want to come and say, yes, there is a discriminative attitude, and it's based not necessarily on emotions, trust me, it's based on outcome. I'm doing that not based on emotions, but outcome in the field, and now I'm done. The policy, yes, there is a policy of the district attorney, sorry, the state attorney. In October 2000, when 13 protesters were killed, they were busy of trying to reinforce the prosecution against the protesters. And the police, when they asked, okay, why didn't you investigate it, they said, we're waiting for complaints. That does present the response of the state and the government to such an act, when the question is how to teach them a lesson, those who are being violent. They forget this October 2000, and the state had a hand in it. And there were crimes against those people that were performed by the state when they do worry about enforcing the law against the protesters. And there is absolute neutralization of a legal and moral responsibility. Yes, I do believe, with emotion, without any emotion, to mention that there is something here that doesn't seem to be very equal. The suffering of others is not in Sri Lanka, at least to pass a lie, the responsibility of the media. Since so many crimes and the suffering that they cause is direct and indirect by the Israelis, by the soldiers. This is not Rwanda. Therefore, this is a responsibility, to my understanding, this is a responsibility towards the suffering. And not just there is a certain suffering somewhere, we need to present some of it. I would expect all of us, when we identify with the suffering of others, we will also know how to judge the acts that cause this suffering. So I would like to wrap it up. I'll start from the end. Abir, you mentioned emotions, and I think this is very relevant. Emotions are very relevant, especially in those aspects, especially in our reality. First of all, to identify those feelings and not to neutralize them, because we are professionals and we need to try to be, and it's very hard because our reality is very complex. And I'm sorry, unfortunately, the judge Orner is not here anymore. She said I have a problem with defining parties within the state of Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen, and there is another Israeli citizen that is supporting the war, is not supporting the war. They are not them, others, the enemy. If they want to define themselves as my enemy, it's his own decision. This is his solution. This is his right to do that. But for me, I cannot define them as them. The whole opening point should be that we talk about the legal phenomena. And my worries, my problems, my concerns, my child is fighting now, my child is under missiles in comparison to another child. That influenced my consideration, of course, and we need to recognize that, to identify that, and to neutralize it, and to reach legal verdicts. What does mean legal? It doesn't matter who you're facing, who is standing in front of you. The only thing that matters are circumstances that, of course, relevant. You will reach the same verdict. And then this is a legal decision and not an emotional decision. Yeah, it's an independence principle that is crucial here. Consider the matter whether there is a difference. I understand we don't have much time. Whether there is a difference between termination of employment of a university employer or municipality or just or parliament member. Expressions here. There is an international law that says the context is important in the university. That's supposed to be maybe the only place where, especially in our complex reality, where one can express and to present in complete freedom opinions within the limitations of the law, of course. In comparison to the municipality worker, yes, it's true, she's a psychologist. I'm not sure the connection is so direct, but he's a representative of the authority, and the authority is supposed to be objective, without any color. If you have a color, this is the public. The public has different aspects in color. We have our religion, we have our opinions, and this is fine. But as a public servant, you cannot express your own opinions with certain colors. Unfortunately, we'll have to wrap it up. And I would like to thank you for participation in the panel. I think we touched really complex matters, and maybe one of the matters we didn't really focus upon. I think we should really start to think about it in the future. But our skills in consumption of medium, social media, and more traditional media as well. I think those approaches that were presented, they're very protective. The government should be involved, the state should be involved, the citizens can't really consume it properly. Can we teach them to consume media in a proper manner, to work in the media scene in a proper manner, to understand that Facebook is not neutral, that the economical interests may be behind it, to understand all the recent research teaching about certain cave in which I sit in a Facebook and nobody's listening to me, I'm just listening to myself and echoing my voice, and there is a certain level of extreme involved in it. Well, to understand that to write something is different from crying in front of the TV screen, and to remember that the machine is keeping it on and that privacy is not really existing as well, that the authorities can really find us and trace those expressions. So maybe the freedom of speech in Israel is a miracle that has been just slightly shaken up, or is it something that is under a certain thread with those forces that we're facing? I think the second opportunity, and thank you for listening. And this is it.